Good morning, everyone. Sunday at
I'm just trying to look at semantics.
Welcome to Prop Making, Bringing Art to Life. My name is Jason Coleman. I've been making props for about 8 years, working on costumes for about 8 years, going to conventions, having a great time, and I'm entirely self-taught, like a lot of prop makers out there. But along the way, I've picked up a lot of really useful tips and tricks from other major prop makers, and it's helped me quite a bit. We're here to help share some of those tips. With me today is Cosplay for Us All, their family. I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name's Jay Parkinson.
I'm Wendy. This is Courtney. Courtney's doing her impression of Stig today. She shall not talk. We've been doing this as a family for about 3 years. Actually, the very first convention that we went to as a group was Gen Con in 2011. And that gave us the bug for cosplaying and prop making, and it's just gone crazy from there. So we love it.
So, before we get started, we're going to talk a little bit about what prop making is, because it's actually a really big field. It's not exclusive just to costumes and cosplay. Prop makers in general make everything that you see on the set in pretty much every film. Now, of course, we're primarily concerned with what prop making is as far as costume making, so that's what we're probably primarily going to be focused on, but you can really apply most of these skills to any kind of prop making. It's an important aspect of what we're going to be talking about today. So, usually when we get to work on a prop, after we've decided what it might be, I'm assuming you guys generally have the idea in mind of what you might want to be trying to make, we go through various stages, and they're all pretty clear stages and a good guideline to follow. The first stage is, of course, planning. You're going to be wanting to go out and gather a lot of reference photos for whatever it is you're trying to do. If it's a game, try and get as many screenshots from the game as possible. If it's from a comic, get good pictures and images of what the prop might be. This is going to be really valuable for you later on, so you don't have to guess and approximate what things might look like. This is going to be also really valuable when you do one of the next steps, which is blueprinting, to help get things to look to scale.
We like 3D models.
Yeah, sometimes.
Anytime you can get your hands on a 3D model, and there's a lot out there, that's really the best source. We have a website that we like to go to. It's called sketchfab.com, and you can upload any 3D models you might have, and you can rotate it around and get measurements, and it's really, and it's free. It's a really good source. It's actually what we used to do a lot of work on the Zero Blade that we did. Because a lot of times in the games, even getting the screenshots, you can only do it when the character is moving and swinging the blade around, and it's not always easy to get a nice clear shot to get all the details you want. So anytime you can get a 3D model, that's definitely the way to go.
Also, don't hesitate to leverage other people's research. A lot of cosplayers out there have already probably made the prop that you're thinking about making, and they've probably already documented a lot of this stuff on pages, especially on YouTube and on Facebook. It's really helpful. The cosplay community in general is really friendly, and there are great places that can help you out for this planning phase. It's also important during the planning phase to figure out how this prop is going to fit with some of the other parts of your costume. If you make something that stands alone but doesn't fit in with everything else, or won't fit against other parts of your armor, or leg pieces or weapons and stuff like that, you have a really bad time. It's hard to walk around with a big giant weapon when you have weird gauntlets and you weren't necessarily planning on how you were going to carry this particular beautiful weapon, gun, whatever it might be, because you were too focused in on individual parts as opposed to the whole picture.
Yep.
So, like I said, once you've gathered together a lot of your reference pictures, you're going to be wanting to figure out a blueprint. Some people skip this step, and that's okay, that's not a problem, but at that point you're sort of winging it, and you might get some parts of it to scale improperly relative to other parts of your costume. A lot of times what I end up doing is taking vector art of a piece that I've already found reference art for, and I print it out to scale, so you can see exactly how big this blade is supposed to be relative to this blade, how big the guard is supposed to be. This is how big it's going to be when it's inside of my hand, and being able to lay the pieces across it and measure to scale before you start fitting things together is really, really valuable.
Yes, paper is your friend. Paper, cardstock is one of our favorites. It's a little sturdier than paper, but it still has flexibility and it's inexpensive. So before you start going and spending a lot of money on materials, if you can make up a dummy out of cardstock or even cardboard, you'll be a lot happier if you have to start all over again and you've only wasted a couple of bucks on cardboard than if you've just thrown away a few $100s. Everybody makes mistakes. Even if you've been prop making for years and years, you're still going to have screw-ups and still be kicking yourself.
Yeah, that's incredibly true. Yes, you really want to prototype in really cheap materials, which, speaking of cheap, you want to start talking about budget. You need to come up before you start going on a project, what your budget is going to be. And I always kind of split my budget into two different halves. There's the actual materials that are going to go into building the prop, and then there's going to probably be funds for tools that I know I'm going to be able to leverage again for other props. And I don't really like to group together the tools that I'm going to be buying that I can leverage again in with the rest of my materials. So do keep that in mind, figure out your budget early, and be pretty realistic with it. You can have a $10 prop, or you can do a $100 version of the prop. The two actually might not look that different. What you're talking about is once you get to really high-end, accurate details, the difference between being 90% to 100%, the price skyrockets. So ask yourself if that last 10% of accuracy is really worth all the extra money you're going to be putting into this thing.
A lot of times budget also impacts the durability of the prop as well.
True.
If you're only going to use the prop for a convention or a Halloween party or whatever, and you know you're not going to really use it again, you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. You can go on the less expensive side, do it out of cardboard or plastic or whatever. But if it's something that you plan on using over and over again at several conventions, or something that you want to keep and maybe hang on the wall because you're a real fan of it, like we actually hang our Adams syringe up on the wall in our living room, it's probably going to cost you a lot more than if it's just going to be basically a throwaway. And whatever budget you think you have in mind, at least add another 20% to it, because it's always going to cost you more.
Yeah, I usually end up doubling mine.
Yeah, I didn't want to scare them.
So once you come up with your budget, you have to start figuring out the next phase, which is sourcing all your materials. That's where are you going to get what you're going to build this out of. So knowing what your budget is going to help drive what you're going to build your props out of. If your budget is really low, then you're going to be wanting to do a lot of repurposed sourcing. That's where you go to thrift stores and you're going and getting your Nerf guns and you're getting your parade bats.
50-cent bat from Goodwill.
Yep. So low budgets usually want to do a lot of repurposed sourcing. It really helps cut down on the overall costs, and it helps cut down on your overall build times by a lot. However, if you're going to go from scratch, that's fine too. That's awesome. That's what I like to do a whole lot. But you have to think a lot about the materials relative to what the actual materials. This is an important point that I always try to make to people when they're talking about building props. They'll see some amazing axe from a game or some realistic looking armor, and they want to go out and make it out of metal and have all these heavy wooden parts or whatever it might be to make it accurate to what the prop actually was. And that might not always be the best idea. Once again, back when you were planning, you've got to be realistic about the fact that if you're going to be carrying this prop around and it's made out of metal, it's going to be ridiculously heavy. Nothing for a video game character to run around with this thing, but trust me, even a 10-pound prop can be arduous to carry around for 4, 5, 6 hours at a convention, so always be aware of the weight when you're considering your sourcing. All
Also,
that,
a lot of conventions won't let you have metal or sharp,
yeah,
those kind of things. So you also have to, if you have a particular convention in mind, it's a good idea to go to their website and check out what their restrictions are for weapons and base your build on that. One of the first conventions that we were going to, we actually went ahead and started building this 7-foot-long sword only to find out that the materials we were using, the convention did not allow. We found this out the night before the convention and had to go and completely remake the prop overnight.
and it looks like we made it in
It
one
does.
night.
So always check your convention guidelines before you start your build.
So just because you might not be using the materials that you're going to be going forward with as a final prop, your lightweight ones, doesn't mean you can't use them during the build process. And we're going to get to this a little bit later on, but if you're going to end up doing molds of stuff, you can still use authentic metal pieces and heavy wooden pieces to help get you the form. Indeed, wood is actually one of the best ways to craft a prop and get it all ready and then take a mold of it, because wood is just a fantastic material to work with in general, but it can be pretty heavy. A good point. There's also, there's also a material that we like to use called MDF. It's,
You're probably familiar with it. We have a little sample.
it stands for medium density fiberboard, and it's like an artificial wood, and it's wonderful to work with. It's easy to cut into and shape and use all your tools on. So you can figure out your great big gun, or figure out your prop, or figure out pieces of armor, make them out of this wood, and then go forward with making your cast and use a lighter weight material for your finished product. So don't hesitate to leverage some heavy stuff during the building process if you know you're going to change the cast form. There's also a lot of different kinds of plastics, tons of different kinds of plastics, and in that same vein are foams. One of the more popular kinds of plastics that are out there right now is called Worbla. It's a thermoform plastic. There's actually lots of different thermoform plastics out there. Friendly plastic is another one. So Worbla is like a great big sheet of plastic that you can easily shape and bend using a heat gun. And that's a wonderful material to make armor or large flat pieces, anything with compound curves. It's relatively cheap for the size of the props that you can make, so it's always a really good starting point when you're going to be fabricating completely from scratch.
The nice thing about Worbla is there's no waste either. A lot of plastics, like what we use a lot of is various Sintra or PVC foam boards and acrylics and stuff like that. If you cut a piece out, you have waste. You try to limit your waste, but with Worbla, you can actually take the scraps left over, warm them up, and push them together, roll them together, and you have a piece that's actually workable. So there's zero waste with Worbla.
Yeah, Worbla is wonderful like that. As a matter of fact, any material that you know you can reuse like that is fantastic. Once again, we're always talking about budget and how much we can save and cut corners, because it's probably not necessarily the cheapest thing when you start getting into some of the bigger stuff. So there's also plexiglass, which I think they demonstrated earlier. This is great for really flat pieces because you're not going to be doing any curves whatsoever with them, but it's really durable, like shockingly so. So if you know you're going to have large planes, plexiglass is fantastic. They cut into shape. Yep.
I'm going to pass around some pieces of Sintra. Comes in various thicknesses. This can be heat formed. This can be drilled. It can be sanded. Paint's really, really good. Any kind of paint that sticks to plastic, sticks to Sintra, absolutely fantastic. It's very good for making various forms of armor, prop weapons, acrylic. This is 2 pieces of acrylic that have been laminated together. It's what we use to make our Global Zero blade. Comes in all kinds of colors. This is called PETG plastic. Can also be heat formed, can be cut, drilled, sanded. It's what's used to make Portland's visor there.
But also water bottles.
And also water bottles. It comes in various thicknesses. ABS plastic, a lot of the stormtroopers and Darth Vaders and whatnot, their costumes are heat formed out of ABS plastic. And of course, always from the EVA foam mats, which a lot of the armors that you see. Most of Courtney's armor is made out of various forms of foam. Any of the Mass Effect characters, the Halo characters, they're all made out of the EVA floor mats that you see at most home improvement stores.
Yeah, cosplayers have come to become the natural enemy of yoga mats everywhere, mutilating them for the past decade.
Yes.
And it's very inexpensive. You usually pick up a 4-pack of 2 foot by 2 foot sheets for about $8, I think. And that goes a long way.
You can get them on sale at
Harbor Freight.
Yes.
Harbor Freight is one of the best places you can go to get materials. It's dirt cheap.
Yep.
Don't recommend getting your tools there. Get your materials.
Short-term tools.
You're on a budget and you don't got people.
There's also clays. Now clays I hesitate to bring up because I rarely use clay as a final material unless it's for a really small piece. Clay is really brittle when it dries, or certain clays are really brittle when they dry. So while they're fantastic in order to get exact shapes for molding, I would very rarely ever use it in a finished piece, other than like maybe a brooch or a tiny detail somewhere that you're just kind of in a hurry for. Even then, I'd be kind of iffy about it.
Yeah, I agree. Nowadays, a lot of people, instead of using the clay, they'll use the Warbler.
Warbler or more friendly plastics,
Yes.
kind of thermoform plastic. It's like
It's also very good.
friendly plastic in particular is just a handful of really small beads that you can use a heat gun on to melt together, and then it'll dry by itself. I mean, as it cools, or you can throw it in some boiling water, and it'll become very pliable, and that'll be completely waterproof when it cools. You usually have to heat it up multiple times while you're working with it because it dries fairly quick, which is good. Don't burn your hands while it is pliable. You kind of want to use tools in general because it does take a good deal of heat, usually by a heat gun, not your blow dryers, to become malleable and workable. So, once we're all done planning and we're all done gathering our materials, we move on to the build process, which is what a lot of people have a lot of questions about usually. So it's a good idea to start talking about the different tools that we use to manipulate our source materials. Aside from your obvious kinds of tools, scissors and X-Acto knives and different kinds of files and sandpapers and whatnot, probably the first most useful tool, power tool that I've ever bought was a Dremel tool. Now, I can't emphasize enough how much I overworked my Dremel tool because indeed after I was done with my cordless one, I needed to go get a corded one because I wanted more power. Dremels are, if you're not familiar with them, just a little rotating tool. It has a handle and then it has a rotating tip, and there are tons of different tips out there. There are cutting tips and sanding drums and different drill bits for them. They're all fantastic and very easy to find. So, I love my Dremel tools, and I know you guys even like the flexible head.
Yes, yeah, we have a flexible shaft, so sometimes you gotta get into tighter spots. And it's kind of like a dentist tool, you know, you get the shaft coming down and just get in there tight. So.
Yeah. So Dremel tool, hands down the first tool I would recommend for any cosplayer to pick up. Also, if you're going to be using any thermoform plastics, a really nice heat gun. Don't use other methods, don't use blow dryers, don't use fire to warp your Warbler. I've been guilty of many of these sins in the past. A good heat gun, and be aware and read the instructions because it's very easy to burn yourself on these things.
It looks like a hair dryer, but it is not.
Yes. Touch that tip after you've been using it, and it hurts.
So once you have, the Dremel tool will get you to 90% accuracy easily. But once you get past that, you're either looking at specialty tools for very unique purposes, or you're looking at time-saving tools. So an example of a time-saving tool would be something like a scroll saw or a bandsaw. These are going to be able to cut through large amounts of material much quicker and much cleaner than you could with a Dremel. So you could potentially accomplish some of this stuff with your Dremel, but these larger tools will be very helpful if you're trying to make things speedy and accurate.
Yeah.
And Craigslist is your friend if you're trying to buy tools. Craigslist garage sales, we picked up probably half of our power tools dirt cheap at various garage sales around the area.
I think we picked up our first bandsaw for around $20.
Yeah. The table saw was like $30.
There are other tools that will be really helpful for you, but we're kind of getting into dangerous areas. Smaller lathes can be very helpful. This is something you put a piece of material inside of, and it rotates the material so that you can carve into it and make symmetric cylinder shapes. These are probably one of the most dangerous tools you can have in your workshop, because if you have any loose clothing, hair, or anything, and it gets caught in there, it revolves really fast, and it's going to be pulling you in with it. So be careful if you start using a lathe. You might want to take some workshop classes for safety's sake.
That goes for any power tool that you're using. You want to make sure before you go into the shop that you have safety goggles, you have proper respirators if need be. For example, the MDF, you really have to have at the very minimum a dust mask, because this stuff is dusty and nasty. No dangling stuff. If you have long hair, put it back in a ponytail, put a hat on. No ties on your hoodies. That's a real danger in a shop, believe it or not. Have good shoes on, watch your fingers. Safety is very important when you're using any kind of power tools, but especially like a lathe or a bandsaw or something like that.
Yep. A belt sander or disc sander is also in there. This is another very useful. This is one of the ones that will save you the most time, but be aware, be careful with it. You're going to be doing a lot of sanding and a lot of smoothing, so it's very tempted to always have it there and be playing around with it. And just be careful and be aware the whole time. It's also important if you're going to be working with the Dremel and you're going to be cutting into plastics, especially like Nerf guns, to have safety goggles. You don't necessarily need well, I'm not going to say don't wear a respirator, because I'll get beat up for that probably. But do wear safety glasses at the bare minimum, because when you're cutting into that any kind of plastic, especially Nerf gun plastic, it will throw molten shards of plastic at you, and the worst thing to happen is for it to fly into your eye.
Yep, absolutely. Even if you're just standing watching somebody else doing it, definitely your partner should have goggles on as well, because that stuff flies all over the place.
So we've got a lot of our materials, and we've been working with our different tools, and most of these tools, you know, are really made for destructive purposes. We're cutting into things, we're sanding into things, we're taking stuff away. We really need to think about how we're going to start attaching and putting things together. So there are lots of different methods by which to do that. All kinds of different epoxies or glues or mechanical holds, and it's important to know what to use and when. So we'll talk about mechanical holds first. These are pieces that are going to have some mobility to them, that are going to have a lot of stress on different joints where you're attaching things, and you're going to want to secure them better than with just super glue or epoxy, because it'll be easy with the amount of stress that's applied for them to pull apart. So an example of a mechanical hold would be a screw going through something, or any kind of snap attachment. Rivets are another really great way to secure two different pieces together.
Riveted together. Because we knew that the weight of the blade would put a lot of stress on the handle, so it's actually riveted all the way through. There's an aluminum, sorry, safety first. There's an aluminum channel that holds all the acrylic together, and there's a piece of metal down here to hold the whole shebang together. So rivets were our method of choice to hold this whole thing together. You definitely don't want to be waving this around and have the blade fly off. Poke somebody in the eye.
Yeah. So for a lot of these mechanical holds, I highly suggest you go and look online, because there are so many different materials out there, and there are right and wrong ways to attach two different pieces of materials. I don't think I could ever conceivably cover that with an entire day worth of talking about all the different materials. But for the most part, I really like rivets. I really like screws. I like bolts more than I like screws. You'll use your Dremel tool to drill in and make a hole, then you'll put a bolt through, and you'll secure it with a nut, and you're usually really good to go from there. So the other kind of attachment that you're going to be talking about are going to be your different kinds of glues with varying degrees of strength.
So many glues.
So many different kinds of glues. Probably the strongest kinds of glues or attaching chemicals are going to be your epoxies. I'm a big fan of 5-minute epoxies. It usually comes in a 2-part compound. It may or may not be something that you can use with your hands. A lot of the waterproof 5-minute epoxies, you break off a piece and there's some of the part A is on the outside, some of the part B is on the inside, so you don't have to carefully measure equal amounts of both of them. So I love that stuff. You just cut off a small piece of that epoxy, you rub it together for about 30 seconds to make sure it's all homogeneous, and then you can apply it and stick the 2 pieces together, and in about 5 minutes it can be more secure than the rest of this stuff put together. Your joint probably won't be the piece that breaks, it'll be the wood on either side or the plastic on either side. Stepping down from there are usually your super glues. These aren't going to take a lot of stress. Usually I only recommend attaching flat pieces to flat pieces, or where there's a lot of surface area to secure super glues.
It's very important to read the packaging of the glue that you choose to use and make sure that it's appropriate to the material that you're using. And also to test it first.
Yes.
Test it, let it sit overnight, and then
You're making stuff like the samples we're passing around, you're making something, you're going to have something like that around, so you can always take those and glue those together and then give a little bit and then try and tear it apart. You'll get a feel for how strong it is.
So now we know different ways to cut apart and put things together. We're also going to talk a little bit about the mold process. Let's say you've made a master sculpt. This could have been made out of your woods or your clays. A lot of people have a lot of questions about how to make sculpts, so this is a big field of prop making, so we can't go into everything, but we'll do an abbreviated version of it. After you take a master sculpt, so this was made out of paper clay and then sealed really well. There are all kinds of really good sealers. It's important to use a sealer, especially if you're using any kind of a clay. It's also important not to use any natural clays. You want polymer clays whenever you're working with molds, because silicone will not cure around any kind of latex or sulfur. Sulfur is found in a lot of natural clays. So I recommend polymer clays, and paper clay is another good one. This is made out of paper clay. So you usually end up taking your master sculpt and pouring a silicone mold over the top of it. That's what this guy is. The silicone is usually pretty thick, but it can't hold its shape. It's pretty malleable. So it can't serve its purpose to make a mold in its current form. You need what's called a mother mold to go over the top of it. You can see there are different bumps on the outside of this. These are what's called registration keys. And these help make sure that the mold goes into the mother mold properly in the exact same spot. So I have a really strong plastic paste that goes on the outside. There are a lot of different kinds of mother molds that you can use out there. I really like plastic paste by Smooth On. Some people use plaster strips or fiberglass. But at this point, this is your entire mold put together. The mother mold holds the shape of the silicone, and the silicone holds all the details about your sculpt. After that, you decide what you want to be making your cast out of. Usually some kind of polyurethane plastic. Some people make them out of fiberglass, and at that point you use different kinds of fiberglass, either the interwoven, the sequence, what is it, the random fiber pattern, and then the, I don't know, remember the name of it. There's 2 different kinds of fiberglass. Either there's a random sequence or there's a woven sequence, I think that's what it's called. And then you put a different fiberglass resin on it, and that helps hold its shape. That fiberglass is really strong by comparison to polyurethane plastics, but both of them serve their purpose for the most part for prop making. So you end up taking a bowl of polyurethane plastic, and then you have to end up doing a lot of different finishing processes to it. Both of these masks have a lot of defects inside of them, and even if you take the best mold out there and you pull a cast of it, they're going to be small defects. Little tiny bubbles that might have been inside of the resin, or a slight bend somewhere that you didn't necessarily anticipate. These are usually filled in with Bondos, and then sanded down smooth. Once again, we talked about how you're going to be doing different kinds of sanding. You usually want to start with your higher grits first, and then move down to lower grits. I usually don't go much past 220. Some people end up, when they want really, really, really glossy, smooth surfaces, they do something called wet sanding. I don't have a lot of experience with that particular piece, but it's a popular next step afterwards. Good. You want to explain a little bit about how that works?
The way the wet sanding goes is it's a mixture of sanding and almost washing the finish off. You take the wet sanding sandpaper, which when you feel it, it doesn't even feel like sandpaper because it's so smooth. They actually use it when their cars are on. You soak the sandpaper until it's good and wet. You get your, in this case it was the helmet, and you just sand it like you're regularly sanding it, but you want to keep the sandpaper very wet. And when you're done with it, it comes out incredibly smooth. And the smoother the object is, the higher the gloss, because the paint is going to pick up any kind of little defect in the item that you're painting. So when you see weapons and stormtrooper outfits and stuff like that, they've almost definitely been wet sanded a ton. And it's usually not just one time you wet sand. You wet sand and you prime, and then you wet sand and then you prime, and then you wet sand and you prime. You build up a lot of muscles when you're a prop maker because you spend an awful lot of time sanding things.
So let's say you're all done with putting together whatever you're going to put together, be it your repurposed prop, your Nerf gun or whatever, or even one of your different casts. It's now time to start finishing it, which is actually my favorite part. Finishing is usually the paint process and the weathering process. So going over paint, first of all, you're going to want to apply some kind of a primer, especially if it's a plastic. Certain paints will not adhere to plastic very well, so be sure you find a nice plastic primer. Get a good coat on that, let it dry completely. I can't emphasize that enough. Some of these different kinds of primers, some of the different kinds of paints have very long dry times, and it's important to follow those rules. Otherwise, you're going to get bleeding through of colors, or you're going to get a misty color inside of your paint from the chemicals from the primer bleeding through. It's well worth it. Don't ruin all the hard work that you've put into your prop by being impatient near the end just because you feel like you're so close to the finish line. That's how I always feel when I have the finished product. I think, oh, I just have to paint it, and that's real quick. No, take your time with this.
Sometimes that's the longest process, is the painting.
It can be.
And just because you touch it and you go, oh, that's dry, it's not necessarily dry. Read the can or read the jar, whatever it is that you're using, and if it says, 2 hours until you can do a second coat, wait the 2 hours before you do the second coat. It really needs time to set properly, otherwise you get a lot of defects and crackling and peeling, and you got to start all over again with the sanding.
You said it was the most fun process because it really, when you're done, it brings it to life.
Yeah.
That was like when I made this, I did most of the work on this as far as, the shape and everything, and then handed it off to them, and they really brought it to life by putting those details in there, the paint and stuff, and, did that while I was gone, and I came home, and I'm like, wow, that's what I went.
So to go over painting just a little bit, there are enamels and acrylic paints. Your enamels are usually going to come in aerosols, so you can use spray cans or you can use an airbrush. Airbrush kind of has a high learning curve, so I would recommend starting out with aerosols. You find them inside your Lowe's hardware. They have a whole section. You can browse back and forth, and I love walking through all the spray paints. So your enamels dry hard, solid, almost waterproof in a lot of cases, especially in the the Rust-Oleum section. And this is really important because your acrylics, which usually should go on second, are water soluble. And usually what you want to put your enamels on first, get all your good base coats on, especially your metals and solid large colors. You want to mask off areas to make sure you're not spraying one and then you spray the other and it leaks over in the other side. Spray back and forth. So use lots of masking tape when you're spraying. And then after you're done and let your enamels dry really well, then you want to do a lot of your weathering in acrylics. And the key point to that is like I said, the acrylics are waterproof. So when you're applying weathering, you really should be able to apply a bunch of weathering, to like be pretty messy with how you're applying the dirt colors or dark colors, and then you can wipe it away with a wet rag afterwards. And if you're not happy with it even the next day, you should be able to wipe away that completely, and it won't hurt the enamel underneath if you've let the enamel dry. So weathering, you can add and remove until you get the effects that you want. That's really how you're going to get the most realistic look. If you think about it, most of the weathering that's done out there is dirt and grime that's being built up on top of something else. And if you take a wet rag to it, you'll polish that away and you get the raw colors underneath.
Yeah, yeah. Weathering, again, is one of those things that takes a long time to do, and it takes a lot of practice. And it takes like something like our ounce or inch here. I mean, this was painted with the spray can, so this was all shiny and coppery brass looking, ooh, and then you just go, okay, now I gotta make it look dirty. And you gotta bang it up and tons of paint, wipe it off, put it on and wipe it off. It seems rather redundant, but it really does, you know, this is supposed to be something that's been in a post-apocalyptic kind of scenario, so you don't want to be walking around with a bright, shiny weapon unless that's what your character carries, of course.
That's a good point.
Then you don't have to weather anything.
That's one of my pet peeves. I love props, and I love talking to other prop builders, and I love looking at other people's costumes, and I can tell when people have worked really hard on their prop and they love it to death, and they've got to the point where it comes to weathering and they get almost scared to do it. And it makes sense. You put sometimes hundreds of hours into these things, and you feel like, I've sewn this beautiful thing, or I put together this beautiful prop, why would I want to make it dirty? I'm just going to ruin it. Really, that can be the last step that makes it look perfectly accurate. If you're doing stuff from your Borderlands, or your Bioshocks, or Fallout, whatsoever, any of these things, if it's from a dirty world, make it look dirty, and that's the last step. That's the final thing that you end up adding to the prop to make it look realistic. Once you're all done with your enamels and your acrylic weathering, you usually go with a sealer. And there are glossy sealers and there are matte sealers. And I usually recommend the matte sealers because the glossy ones, if you apply too heavy of a layer, it's going to shine and sparkle, and it's not going to make the weathering look right to some degree. So do keep that in mind depending on what kind of prop you're doing. If it is supposed to be a shiny, beautiful piece of metal, it's not supposed to be filthy, go ahead and go for your gloss, and that's totally fine. Just whatever you do, don't apply too much gloss of whichever type, because it starts to make a cloudy layer over the top of whatever your paint was before.
If you need something to be very glossy, like you're doing a blade or whatever, and it has to be very glossy, you might want to go and just put tons and tons of layers of the glossy sealer on top. But actually, your best bet is to put a couple of coats of the glossy on and then wet sand. And then do a couple more coats of the gloss and then wet sand. That will help keep the hazy finish down. And yet, each time you do it, it builds up the gloss a little bit more.
So once you put all that together, you end up with a finished piece. This started out as the master sculpt, came out of one of these. You've applied a whole bunch of paint layers, applied a whole bunch of weathering, sealed it all together, added a couple of extra pieces because you can't obviously cast things that have holes inside of it. You never pull it out of the silicone. But you end up with finished props, and they're usually really durable if you followed and planned everything really well from the beginning. Durability is, of course, one of the most important things when it comes to being done with a prop. We talked about how you don't necessarily want your props to be really flimsy unless they're going to be one-time use. So include that in your planning process and consider that when you're putting everything together in your final steps. Also, wearability. I know our friend over there actually has fans inside of her helmet. You're going to be wearing these things for a long time, so one of the extra things you can do to provide comfort is installing fans or any kind of ventilation in certain parts of your costume. Think about this. You're going to be in it for a long time, and I don't know how many of you guys were here yesterday, but it was hot. It was really warm.
We actually made the helmet so that you have to stay hydrated when you're wearing costumes, of course. So rather than having her have to take the helmet off all the time, we actually chose to put magnets on the visor so that we can just pop it off real quick, give her a little drink of water or a granola bar or whatever, and just whoop.
you've got some of your finished props all together, you've painted them, but you're wanting to take it to the next step, we'll say. There's tons and tons of extra things you could be doing. One of the most popular things are installing different lights inside of your props. My most basic recommendation is go to sales after Halloween, find anything that lights up and gut it. That has your battery right inside of there, it has all the resistors measured out. You might have to add extra lengths of wire inside of there, which you could do without a soldering iron if you don't want to. You could just splice the wire and apply some electrical tape. A little risky, I've had props malfunction because I was cutting corners like that. So be aware of that. That's the easiest way to start installing some of your lights.
Yep, absolutely.
If you want to get a little bit fancy, then you can go online and start purchasing your own LEDs. There are tons of calculators out there to figure out what resistors you might need. And for the most part, I would just say like 2 LEDs and a 9-volt battery, and you're usually in pretty good shape. You know, usually, well, you might need a resistor after that. You might need a third. Like I said, go to the different calculators, but a 9-volt battery and 2 lights, and you're usually good to go. That's a good next step if you want to start building your own electronics. And then install a switch, and you can turn it on and off. It'll be great. If you don't want to install a switch, just pull out the battery. That works fine too. So that's, for the most part, how we put together our props. That's how we plan and put things together. We'd love to hear some of your questions. You guys have anything else to say before we open it up to that? No.
Open it up to questions. Who's got a question?
Yes.
Gentleman in the back.
I'm interested in the material of the visor, the shaping process, and the different methods for tinting.
As far as, well, the material first. Did you get your hands on the clear piece of plastic?
The one that was blue?
No,
there's
it was
a
completely clear.
Piece of plastic.
Oh, right behind you. There you go. Yeah, that's the PETG, which is, like as we mentioned earlier, the plastic bottle material, which we bought in a sheet. As far as the shaping process, it's called vacuum forming.
Okay.
We kept it really low budget. Maybe one day we can buy an actual vacuum form machine. But we built a box with a bunch of holes in it. We could hook up a vacuum cleaner to it, heated up the plastic, dropped it down on top of what they call a buck, that's the shape of the visor, and then sucked the air out of it, and then cut, trimmed, and all that stuff.
When
As
we
far as
started
dyeing,
this project, the whole thing was, it was 3D model, 3D printed. But when you print something out of a 3D machine, it's very rough, it's in pieces, it needs a lot of work until it becomes an item that can be cast, which is what we did. We cast this out of resin. So when we had all the 3D pieces together, one of the pieces was the actual plastic, hard plastic shape for the visor. You take that and you can't just stick it on the vacuum form machine. You have to build what's called a buck around it, which is, it could be insulation, it could be wood, it could be whatever, and that goes on the vacuum machine. You heat up the sheet of plastic, and then put it over there, hook your shot back up to it, and it goes. We actually have a video of it on our YouTube channel. You can check it out. But we built the vacuum form for under $100. Tinting it, there's 2 different ways that you can do it. There's the spray tint that you can get at any auto parts store. I actually don't recommend that because we did that with our first visor because we were in a pinch. Very, very poor visibility, no matter how careful you are. This has actually been dyed, just like in a bucket of dye, sorry. Joanne carries something called poly-eye dye, which is made specifically for plastics. Like most people use it for dyeing polyester fabrics. We use it for dyeing zero visors. And you dye it just like anything else. You heat up the water, you put the dye in, you let it sit. Usually if you're dyeing clothing, you want the water to be boiling. With the PETG, you don't want it higher than 150 degrees because it will deform the plastic. So we usually shoot for about 140, you let it soak, rinse it in cold water, and you have a visor. It's kind of like looking at sunglasses.
Once again, can you repeat the name of this product and the name of the dye?
This is PETG. I'm sure it's got a really long name, but that's the abbreviated version of it. And the dye is poly-eye dye. And you can get that at Joann's, Hobby Lobby, Michael's, anywhere that has clothing dye. Next question?
Do you have a handout sheet with all of this stuff on it?
YouTube is your friend.
YouTube's great. We do have some cards up here, and we do have some references for other people we've learned stuff from, because as he said earlier, the cosplay community, people are so willing to share so much information and stuff. So that's pretty much how we learn a lot of stuff.
We have some cards up here, our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Pretty much any project that we do, we document from start to finish, and we just share it. Even if we screw things up, which boy oh boy do we ever, we share those too so that people know, okay, you know what we did here, don't do that.
And after we're done here, we'll be out in the hall. Feel free to come out and talk to, we want to, you know, I know we're short on time here, but more than happy to talk to anybody out there.
One of the best places you can go online is called the RFP, the Replica Prop Forum. And a lot, there are tons of celebrities, like the guys from Mythbusters are on there a whole bunch, helping people, talking to them, recommending different techniques. People post entire build processes, details about what materials they're using. I can't emphasize enough, that's a really, really great place to go. Look for something that you're already trying to make, and I bet someone else has already made a 100-page thread all about it.
Tested.
Yes.
What is the base suit that the Armory is actually built onto Zero?
Under, it's actually custom printed cotton.
Okay.
We had the hexagon patterns and whatnot. We had those printed, we designed it and then had it printed at Spoonflower, which I don't necessarily recommend because it was a nightmare trying to get the fabric. But there are a couple of websites that will allow you to print basically anything that you can ever design. And it's just cotton and denim, and then the armor here has actually been wrapped in fabric and then painted, so that we don't have to worry about a lot of the cracking and stuff that you get if you paint fabric.
Okay.
Right down the
Where do you get a lot of the materials for like the borderlands, like silicone and all that plaster and stuff?
Smooth on, smooth on.
All together now, smooth on.
Like, I wouldn't use anyone else's materials for making casts and making molds whatsoever. Smooth On is a great website, not a great place to navigate because it supports so much. And there are so many different kinds of molding materials and casting materials and for different techniques.
They also have a YouTube channel which has a ton of actual videos.
Ton of videos. And if you're ever up in the Chicago area, I think that's the place,
That's
the
the
closest.
nearest place, yeah.
Yes.
It was
They have walked in the door there. First time we've been there, it was like, wow, prop maker's
Look,
dream.
I saw a hand up in the very back. Lady in the very back?
No?
No? Okay. Gentleman right here?
Yeah, I heard you mention a little bit about 3D printing. I'm a 3D modeler, like I do some of that on my own.
Right.
Let's be friends.
But yeah, so like how much is that changing the industry? How much is that really?
Oh, it's massive, massively changing the industry. So many of the prop makers that we know that have been doing this for a decade are just now starting to get into the 3D printing because they see the advantages to it. Very rarely as a prop maker can you go and get something 3D printed and just go, ah, now we can wear it. Like there's no way that we could have had her wear the helmet that actually came out of 3D printing because it's so very rough. You know, it's, as you know, it's layers and layers and layers of plastic, so it's very rough. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to it. But if you're doing multiple projects and you can outsource a part of that, you know, send it off somewhere to get a gun or a helmet or something 3D printed, you can be working on other things instead of having to sculpt or mold or whatever. And then when that comes back, you can start working on that. So it's very definitely a time saver and gives you a high accuracy as well.
Just to clarify, we didn't 3D print that. We had
No,
somebody
we
else.
had it done.
So we got one more minute. We're going to take one more question. Take the Harley in the back.
Yes. Any advice on making masks?
Here.
I'm sorry, say again?
Advice on
Any
making
advice
that.
on making masks?
Okay. Don't start with a mannequin from your makeup store. That's an important part of making a mask. Those things are too small. I would recommend if it's going to be a type forming mask, then you get together some friends and do a plaster strip cast to your face. And then you can start sculpting over the top of that. Be careful and do apply enough layers to have a durable version of your face, but don't apply so many that it loses the detail of your face. So I absolutely had people do a plaster cast of my face before I started doing any sculpting of this mask up here. So
we actually have a life cast of Courtney's head, which was made with smooth-on products, where you actually do the whole silicone, and she's encased like a mummy, and then the plaster out on the outside.
doll faces on her.
Yeah, we draw faces
Yeah.
on it. And then we cast that in a two-part product, which actually comes out like stone when you're done with it. So anytime we need to do any kind of masks or helmets or anything, we've got her head right there. So if you plan on doing a lot of this, and you have some friends who want to have fun and you can trust, you might want to invest in doing some light casting.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was a great panel. We had a lot of fun.